Hi, this is Sarah with House Copper and Cookware, and today I'm just going to give a really quick FYI cross of what it takes to make cast iron cookware in brief. A lot of times when I'm out in public, I get people coming up to me and go, "Can you make or why don't you make this type of griddle?" And as wonderful as it would be to please everybody and do custom orders out of cast iron, it's one thing to just come up with the idea and another thing to actually fabricate something. So, when we decided to make cast iron cookware, we first and foremost wanted something on the smaller side just because for our first run, we didn't want anything too cumbersome. The processing plant, the small family owned and operated foundry we use, could only handle a size that fit on their processing machine. And also, we wanted something that would work in people's condos, in small kitchens, in cities, that could still handle making food for anywhere from 2 to 6 people, depending on what you're making. I spoke to my uncle, who's been a blacksmith for 30 years, spoke to collectors of cast iron who know way too much of awesome facts about cookware with the Griswold Cast Iron Association of America. The people who belong to that, not me, but others who belong to that awesome association, are able to look at a piece of vintage cast iron cookware and list off tons and tons of facts, as well as be a wealth of knowledge for any questions I had about the cookware itself, about cast iron. We also spoke to engineers, we spoke to tool and die makers, and we spoke to the people at the foundry, and wanted something that was economical, something that was reminiscent of vintage pieces, and something that was just simple. So I did a sketch on a napkin, gave it to my friend who knows how to put everything in a CAD program, and our first piece came out looking like this. And in case it's not super obvious, you can see the really kind of cut out here where it was a lot too modern, and some of the thinness of the prototype shows how impractical this first idea was. When you're creating cast iron cookware, you need to first and foremost get a tool made. You can call it a tool, you can call it a match plate, you can call it your pattern. All three things essentially mean the same thing. And you work with a tool and die maker who will take a sheet of aluminum and press your pattern from the computer program into that particular piece of aluminum that is created to fit on the processing machine, or iron pouring machine, if you want super layman's terms, in the foundry that you're working in. So you need to have your foundry picked out. You need to know what kind of processing machine they have and the size of the plate that they can handle. Our foundry is limited to a specific size. We can't go bigger than, I believe it is 16 by 20. So the cast iron skillet pattern needed to fit on a plate of that size. Once we had the first set done and we had that prototype, we sent it off to the tool and die maker and we sent it off to the foundry. Everyone came back with the same conclusion, that the piece was far too thin. As much as I really wanted to do a nice thin piece like everyone covets, it would crack during the process of creating the cookware. There are a couple places that can happen, and that's why you often don't see really thin cast iron cookware anymore. There is a line of 2 people on the processing machine, at least at the one here in Wisconsin we work with. One guy is placing the pattern and preparing the mold on one end, and then that gets put on a conveyor belt, which each piece is individually hand poured in by someone else who has a bucket of molten iron that is replenished constantly, and they pour that in from the crucible and fill up your pattern, which then kind of continues on the conveyor belt, cooling slightly before getting knocked off the edge. The sand by that time is burned, it's black, and your piece falls out. It's still attached to the gating, which is the kind of this, what used to be called the spew, but it's the place where the iron is poured in through the tube, if you would, into your finished cast iron piece. The gating is still attached, so you have all these cast iron skillets with these long pieces still attached to them, getting cranked off the belt and landing in a heap. Then from there, they're pulled out. They're still too hot to touch. They're thrown into a bin, and eventually the gating is busted off. It's hand ground, and then it's put into an arburator where it shakes it with like shot and tries to deburr it, the pieces further. That process, any part of that process, if the cast iron is too thin, can lend itself to a ton of your pieces to crack or break off. Once everyone determined that, before we even made the pattern, we started another round of prototyping. So this was the next round. The handle is a little thicker. The walls themselves are a tiny bit thicker. If you can see here, we're still looking at, it's probably barely 1/8 of an inch thick on the handle here. And this went around, and we decided it was still too thin to work and not crack often during the fabrication. So we went to the next round, and that was this piece. And I know you can't see it, and I don't know if it shows, but it's far heavier. There's a ton more material on this. We added a lip to help to keep the edges from cracking. Some of the vintage wares you see, there's usually like chunks off the edges because they didn't have a little bit more protection. It's kind of the same idea when you see old pieces of cookware. If they're made out of copper or tin, they usually are wired or rolled on the top to prevent cracking or denting. Same idea with putting a little bit of lip on this. This actually still was too thin, and once we created the pattern, we had to go back in and spend a few $100s to revise the pattern once it was already made in aluminum to make this thicker, because we still were dealing with it busting off during the casting process. Once that was done, we were able to start pouring iron with success. We get anywhere from 50 to 100 of the final pieces. This is raw cast iron. It's hard to see, and I'm going to put it closer, but it's silver. It's like raw silver. And here's, there's a couple places you can see where someone has hand ground the gating off. And then we take them into the garage, and we take some sandpaper, me and my husband or whatever friends we have over to drink beer and do this with us, and we hand sand the inside to try and smooth it out a little before we season it. The seasoning happens over open fires in the backyard, over big burn barrels, over a fire of anywhere from 600 to 700 degrees, and a lot of organic flaxseed oil from either Wisconsin or North Dakota. And we season them to look like this. They're black, they're shiny, they're not super smooth because it's really very difficult and very expensive and not economical to use really, really fine sand. And, even though there's a little bump to the outside, they still are hand sanded on the inside, and they work great. You throw a brownie mix out of a box in this, you never have to grease it, and it works. But that's my preference. Some people prefer to season it with something else. Some people think that seasoning in an iron is better. I'm not going to go into seasoning preferences because everyone has their own opinions on it, and none of them are really right or wrong. But that's why when you want somebody to make something, sometimes the process is a little bit more involved. And now you know a little more on the cast iron cookware manufacturing process. I look forward to your comments, thoughts, and ideas in the comments, and thanks for watching.